It was the early 2000s, and the streets of New York carried a new sound. The old roar of high-floor buses was fading, and in its place came something boxy, modern in its own way, yet oddly familiar. The Orion VII rolled into the city with its squared-off body, tall windows, and the unmistakable growl of a Detroit diesel. For millions of commuters, this was the face of a new era. But to understand why the Orion VII appeared, we have to step back a decade. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act changed public transit forever. Agencies were now required by law to provide full accessibility, not just for the able-bodied, but for seniors, the disabled, parents with strollers, and anyone who struggled with the steep steps of a high-floor bus. That mandate pushed an industry still clinging to its old ways into unfamiliar territory. Orion had been here before. Their Orion V, a rugged high-floor design from the 1980s, had earned a solid reputation. Their first stab at a low-floor bus, the Orion VI, promised progress but turned into a headache, heavy, unreliable, and short-lived. Transit agencies wanted something better, something that could compete with New Flyer's D40LF, Gillig's low floor, and the sleek Nova LFS coming out of Quebec. By the turn of the millennium, Orion was under pressure. The company needed a product that didn't just tick boxes on a spec sheet, but one that could win contracts in the biggest markets. And so the Orion VII was born. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't radical, but it was practical. A full low-floor design up to the rear doors, with a raised section in back to house the engine. It promised easier boarding, modern accessibility, and a familiar driving experience for operators used to diesel workhorses. When the first Orion VIIs entered service in 2001, few realized they were witnessing the beginning of a new chapter. This wasn't just another city bus. It was the machine that carried North America across the bridge from the old step-up era into the low-floor age. From the outside, the Orion VII was never a beauty queen. It didn't try to be. Its lines were straight, its corners sharp, and its roofline sat tall and boxy. To some, it looked like nothing more than a rolling rectangle of steel and glass. Yet that simplicity was its strength. The design wasn't about flair. It was about function, about meeting the everyday grind of city service without excuses. The first thing riders noticed were the windows. They stretched higher than those on most older buses, letting in more light and giving passengers a better view of the city rolling by. Step inside, and the difference was immediate. The floor sat level with the curb at the front and through the center section. For seniors and people carrying heavy bags, it meant no more climbing stairs just to find a seat. The flat entryway created a natural flow, with wide aisles that made boarding quicker during rush hour. Toward the back, the design revealed its compromise. Because the engine sat in a rear compartment, the flooring had to rise. A small set of steps led up to the back seats, a reminder that the low-floor revolution wasn't complete just yet. Still, that elevated section gave the Orion VII a distinctive two-tier feel, something kids often loved, as it made the rear seats feel like a perch above the crowd. Nothing about the Orion VII screamed futuristic, but it carried itself with quiet authority. Its boxy frame became a canvas for agency liveries across North America, from the blue and white stripes of New York to the red of Toronto. Over time, that plain, functional look etched itself into memory, not as a showpiece but as the dependable face of daily transit in the new century. If the Orion VII's boxy frame gave it presence, its heart gave it personality. Underneath, these buses carried a range of engines that defined the soundscape of the early 2000s. The most common was the Detroit Diesel Series 50 EGR. To passengers, that meant one thing: a deep, almost metallic growl that echoed off city streets. It wasn't the smooth hum of a car engine. It was raw, industrial, and unforgettable. Anyone who rode through Manhattan or Brooklyn in those years can still recall that rising wail as the bus pulled away from a stop. Other agencies ordered their 7s with Cummins ISL power plants, a reliable inline-6 that delivered steady torque and slightly quieter operation. A few even carried Caterpillar C9 engines, giving them a gruffer, throatier note. No matter the option, each drivetrain was paired with a familiar workhorse, the Allison automatic transmission. For drivers, it meant smooth shifts, easy operation, and a setup tough enough to handle the endless stop-and-go of urban service. Mechanics often had mixed feelings. The Series 50 EGR met emission standards of the day but ran hot and demanded more attention than the old two-strokes. The hybrids, paired with smaller engines and electric systems, introduced their own learning curve, adding complexity under the skin. Yet despite those challenges, the Orion VII proved itself capable of handling punishing city routes. For riders, the technical details didn't matter. What stuck in memory was the soundtrack, the sudden hiss of the air brakes, the low rumble at idle, and that unmistakable surge of diesel power when the driver pressed the throttle. It was more than a bus ride, it was the rhythm of the city itself. When Orion unveiled the 7, they weren't just selling another diesel bus. They were pushing something far more ambitious: hybrid technology. At the turn of the millennium, going green was beginning to move from slogans to city budgets. Rising fuel costs, mounting smog concerns, and political pressure all collided, and the hybrid Orion VII looked like the perfect answer. New York City Transit jumped in with both feet. By the mid-2000s, the MTA had purchased hundreds of hybrid 7s, proudly wrapping them in bold lettering that read, "Clean Air Hybrid Electric." For riders, the experience felt different from the moment the bus pulled away. Instead of the familiar diesel roar, the bus glided forward almost silently before the engine kicked in. It was smoother, gentler, and for some, it felt like a glimpse of the future. Under the skin, the system paired a smaller diesel engine with an electric motor and a bank of heavy batteries. The promise was clear: lower emissions, better fuel economy, and a greener image for transit agencies trying to modernize. And in the short term, some of those promises held up. Agencies reported noticeable reductions in fuel consumption compared to their straight diesel fleets. But reality hit hard in the maintenance bays. The hybrid system was complex, parts were expensive, and mechanics had to climb a steep learning curve to keep the buses rolling. Batteries wore out faster than expected, and the cost of replacement sometimes offset the savings at the pump. Transit managers praised the technology in press releases, but behind the scenes they struggled to balance the books. Even so, the Orion VII hybrid carved out a place in history. It was one of the first times North American riders experienced the whisper-quiet launch of an electric motor on a city bus. Imperfect though it was, it signaled that the diesel age was giving way to something new. For the average rider, the Orion VII wasn't an engineering project or a line item on a budget. It was the bus that got them to work, to school, to the doctor's office, or back home after a long day. And in that role, it delivered something new: ease of access. The low-floor layout meant that seniors, parents with strollers, and people in wheelchairs no longer faced the steep climb of 3 tall steps. Instead, boarding was nearly level with the curb. When paired with a kneeling feature and a flip-out ramp, the 7 turned what had once been a struggle into a simple roll-on. Inside, the cabin felt more open than the older high floors. Taller windows filled the space with daylight, while the wide front aisle made it easier for crowds to shuffle in and out during rush hour. Toward the back, the raised floor and small steps were a reminder that the low-floor revolution wasn't total, but many kids actually enjoyed the split-level feel. To them, those back seats felt like a private perch. For drivers, the experience was mixed. The wide windshield and high seating position gave excellent visibility in busy traffic. The familiar Allison transmission meant smooth shifts and fewer surprises. But the hybrids in particular came with quirks. Some operators loved the quiet launch and smoother acceleration. Others complained about sluggish performance on hills and the added complexity of the hybrid controls. Still, day after day, the Orion VII did its job. It might not have been glamorous, but for both riders and drivers, it made city travel just a little bit easier. And that was enough to leave an impression. When the Orion VII first entered service in 2001, few expected it to become such a fixture. Yet within just a few years, it was everywhere. In New York alone, the MTA purchased hundreds, making the boxy profile of the Seven as much a part of the city's landscape as yellow cabs and subway entrances. Toronto's TTC followed suit, filling its streets with fleets of the Canadian-built buses. From Washington, D.C. to smaller agencies across the Northeast and Midwest, the Orion VII became a familiar sight. For Orion Bus Industries, the model was a lifeline. The earlier Orion VI had struggled, leaving doubts about the company's ability to compete with giants like New Flyer and Gillig. But the Seven changed that. With its low-floor design, optional hybrid powertrain, and rugged build, it gave Orion a serious contender in bids across North America. For several years, the Seven was not only competitive, it was winning. The impact went beyond contracts. To millions of Americans and Canadians, the Orion VII defined what a modern city bus looked like in the early 21st century. It wasn't futuristic like GM's RTS of the 1970s, nor was it revolutionary like the first low-floor prototypes from Europe. Instead, it was practical, accessible, and dependable. That very ordinariness became its strength. Over time, newer models would arrive, sleeker and more advanced. But for a generation of commuters, students, and workers, the Orion VII was the bus they caught in the morning rush, the ride they took home at night, and the background to countless everyday stories. In that way, it quietly cemented its place in transit history. For all its practicality, the Orion VII was far from flawless. The most common complaints centered on the hybrid models. On paper, they promised cleaner air and lower fuel bills. In practice, agencies quickly learned that the technology of the early 2000s wasn't as bulletproof as hoped. Battery packs wore down quickly, replacement costs ran high, and the specialized parts weren't always easy to source. What savings came at the pump often vanished in the maintenance shop. Some agencies quietly retired their hybrids early, reverting back to standard diesel units. Even the straight diesel versions had their critics. The Detroit Diesel Series 50 EGR engine, while memorable for its growl, was known for running hot and demanding extra care. Compared with the simpler, more robust power plants of the past, it sometimes felt like a compromise built to satisfy emissions rules more than operators. Mechanics grumbled, and drivers occasionally noticed sluggish performance when a bus was heavily loaded or tackling steep grades. Then there was the matter of looks. While some appreciated the Seven's clean, no-nonsense shape, others dismissed it as downright ugly. Compared with the more sculpted Nova LFS or the sleeker designs coming out of Europe, Orion's boxy bus seemed plain, even dated, almost from the moment it arrived. Durability was another point of contention. Many fleets found that the Seven aged faster than rivals like New Flyer's D40LF. Interiors grew rattly, body panels showed wear, and hybrid systems proved fragile under the relentless pounding of urban service. And yet, despite these shortcomings, the Orion VII kept rolling. Agencies renewed contracts, riders kept boarding, and the bus did its job. Imperfect though it was, it stood as a bridge between eras, a flawed but essential step in transit's evolution. The Orion VII was never meant to be a legend. It didn't turn heads with futuristic curves or wow engineers with radical breakthroughs. What it did was something quieter, yet just as important. It carried millions of ordinary Americans and Canadians through the rhythm of daily life, to jobs, to schools, to family gatherings. It made city buses easier to board, cleaner to ride, and it gave the first real taste of a hybrid future. Today, many have been retired, their boxy frames replaced by sleeker low-floor models. But for those who rode them, the memory remains. The tall windows, the gentle kneel at the curb, and the steady growl of diesel echoing down busy streets. Did you ever ride an Orion VII? Do you still remember the sound, the feel, the look of it pulling up to your stop? Share your story below. And if this brought back a little nostalgia, hit like and don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep these memories alive.